The acrid smell of smoke and ash mingled with the salty taste of tears as Margaret Harper knelt in the charred remains of what had once been her life. Her slender shoulders shook with each sob, her honey-colored hair falling in tangled waves around her dirt-streaked face. The cabin, the one her father had built with his own hands, was nothing more than smoldering timbers and blackened stone. The April sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly on her back, as if to mock her sorrow, the clear Colorado sky a painful contrast to the devastation below. "Madam?" The deep voice startled her, and Margaret whirled around, nearly losing her balance. A tall man stood a few yards away, his stance cautious but unthreatening. The stranger's hat cast a shadow over his features, but she could make out concerned blue eyes studying her from beneath the wide brim. His clothes were trail-worn, the leather vest and denim pants speaking of long days in the saddle. "I don't mean to intrude," he continued, removing his hat to reveal tousled dark hair. "Name's Xavier Eastwood. Saw the smoke from a ways back, and came to see if anyone needed help." His gaze moved from her tear-streaked face to the ruins of the cabin. "Appears I might be right about that." Margaret hastily wiped her cheeks, suddenly conscious of how she must look. "Bandits," she managed, her voice hoarse from crying. "Came in the night. I was in town." She gestured vaguely toward the direction of Silver Creek, the small mining settlement a few miles east. "My father—" Her voice broke. The cowboy Xavier stepped closer, his spurs jingling softly against the hard-packed earth. His eyes searched the area with practiced vigilance. "Are you alone out here now, Miss Harper?" "Margaret Harper." She stood shakily, brushing ash from her skirt with trembling hands. "And yes, I am alone. My father was the only family I had left." The admission sent a fresh wave of grief through her, and she pressed her lips together to keep from crying again. Xavier Eastwood looked at the ruins thoughtfully, then back to her face. His expression softened with an unexpected gentleness that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance. "We'll build again, together," he said, the simple declaration hanging in the air between them. Margaret stared at him, bewilderment momentarily displacing her sorrow. "Sir, you don't even know me." A small smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Maybe not, Miss Harper. But I know what it's like to lose everything." He gestured to the destruction around them. "And I know no one should face rebuilding alone." She studied him warily. In the 3 years since she and her father had settled in this valley, they'd learned that strangers often brought more trouble than help. But there was something in Xavier Eastwood's steady gaze that spoke of reliability, of promises kept. "Why would you help me?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. He replaced his hat, adjusting it slightly against the sun. "Been riding for 2 months looking for a place to settle. I've got skills with wood and stone and—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And I know what it feels like when the world burns down around you." Margaret looked away, her eyes scanning the devastation that had once been her home. Every piece of furniture, every keepsake, every memento of her mother gone. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a small amount of money in her purse from selling eggs in town the previous day. "I don't have much to offer in payment," she admitted, her pride stinging at the acknowledgement. Xavier shook his head. "Not looking for payment, Miss Harper. Just looking for purpose." He glanced at the sky, noting the position of the sun. "It'll be dark in a few hours. Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" The question brought reality crashing back. She had nowhere to go. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and while the townspeople of Silver Creek were friendly enough, she had no close friends there. She began, but faltered. Xavier nodded as if he understood her unspoken dilemma. "I've got a decent camp set up about half a mile east, near the creek. You're welcome to use my tent. I can sleep under the stars." He gestured to what remained of the cabin. Tomorrow, we can see what's salvageable and start planning. Margaret wanted to refuse. Every lesson in propriety she'd ever learned screamed against accepting such an offer from a stranger. But practicality won out over propriety. Night in the mountains was cold, and she had nowhere else to go. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood," she said finally. "I accept your offer of shelter for tonight. But tomorrow, we'll need to discuss terms if you're serious about helping rebuild." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "I'm always serious about my offers, Miss Harper. And please, call me Xavier." "Very well, Xavier. And you may call me Margaret." She took a deep breath, glancing once more at the ruins of her home before squaring her shoulders. "I should gather what I can before we leave." They spent the next hour sifting through the ashes. Most everything was destroyed, but Margaret managed to find a few items that had survived: a cast-iron skillet, a charred but still usable hunting knife that had belonged to her father, and miraculously, a small tin box containing her mother's wedding ring and a faded daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. When she discovered the box, intact beneath a fallen beam, she couldn't contain her sob of relief. Xavier, who had been working nearby, came to her side, but remained silent, understanding the significance without needing explanation. "My mother died when I was 14, Margaret explained after a moment, carefully wiping soot from the small image. "Consumption. My father never removed his wedding band, not even when—" Her voice caught. "Not even when they buried him yesterday." Xavier's expression darkened. "The bandits came right after the funeral?" She nodded, anger flashing through her grief. "They must have been watching, waiting until I was alone." "Did you recognize any of them?" "No. I was staying with Mrs. Calloway in town after the funeral. By the time I returned this morning—" She gestured to the devastation around them. Xavier's jaw tightened. "Cowards, the lot of them." He helped her stand, his hand steady under her elbow. "We should head to camp before dark. You can bring whatever you've salvaged." The walk to Xavier's camp was silent, both lost in their own thoughts. Margaret clutched her small bundle of recovered items to her chest, feeling the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. When they arrived at the camp, she was surprised by how orderly it was. A small tent was pitched beneath a stand of pines, a neat fire pit surrounded by stones, and a pack horse and a handsome chestnut gelding grazed nearby on picket lines. "It's not much," Xavier said, moving to stoke the banked fire, "but it's dry and the tent's sturdy against the wind." "It's more than I have," Margaret replied softly. As the evening shadows lengthened, Xavier prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and hard biscuits. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. When they finished, Xavier insisted she take the tent while he slept outside. "I've spent most of my life under the stars, Miss Margaret," he said when she protested. "One more night won't hurt me none." Too exhausted to argue further, Margaret retreated to the small tent. Inside, she found a clean bedroll and a worn but soft blanket. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as images of her burning home and memories of her father flashed through her mind. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were troubled by flames and shadowy figures on horseback. She woke at dawn to the smell of coffee. Emerging from the tent, she found Xavier already awake, tending a small fire with a pot of coffee bubbling at its edge. "Morning," he greeted her, offering a tin cup of the steaming liquid. "Thought we might head back to your place after breakfast. Make a proper assessment in the daylight." Margaret accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "Thank you." She hesitated, then asked, "Xavier, why are you really helping me? Most men would have ridden on by." He was silent for a long moment, pouring himself a cup of coffee and settling on a log across from her. "7 years ago, I had a farm in Kansas. Small place, but it was mine. Built the house myself, had a few head of cattle, Some chickens. His voice was measured, matter of fact. One night, a group of raiders came through. Dixie veterans turned outlaws, bitter about the war still. They burned everything, took what livestock they didn't kill. Margaret's breath caught. I'm so sorry. Xavier shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. Been drifting since then. Working ranches, trail drives, whatever paid. But I've been looking for a place to put down roots again. He met her gaze steadily. When I saw you yesterday crying beside that burned cabin, it was like looking at myself 7 years ago. Difference is, no one stopped to help me rebuild. The honesty in his words touched something in Margaret, a recognition of shared pain that bridged the gap between strangers. My father always said the measure of a person is what they do when no one's watching, she said softly. Sounds like a wise man. He was. She took a sip of coffee, the bitter liquid fortifying her resolve. If we're going to do this rebuild, then we need to be clear on terms. I won't be a charity case, Mr. Eastwood. A smile tugged at his lips. Back to Mr. Eastwood, are we? She flushed slightly but held her ground. This is business. All right then, Miss Harper. What terms did you have in mind? You help me rebuild, and in exchange, you can stay on the property. We have had 40 acres. Good water from the creek, pasture for your horses, and timber for building. You can have a corner of the land for your own cabin, once mine is rebuilt. Xavier considered this, his blue eyes thoughtful. That's more than fair, but I have one condition of my own. Margaret tensed. And that is? The men who did this, I want to help find them, bring them to justice. The mention of the bandits reignited her anger and she nodded firmly. Agreed. But first, we build. Winter comes early in these mountains and I won't survive in a tent once the snow falls. Xavier extended his hand across the fire. Then we have a deal, Miss Harper. She took his hand, surprised by the warmth and strength in his grip. A deal, Mr. Eastwood. After breakfast, they returned to the ruins of Margaret's cabin. In the clear light of morning, the devastation seemed even more complete, but Xavier approached the task with methodical efficiency. The stone foundation is still solid, he noted, examining the base of the structure. That's a good start. And some of these timbers can be salvaged. He moved around the perimeter, assessing with a practiced eye. We'll need to cut fresh timber for most of it, though. Margaret watched him work, admiring his focus. My father built this place to last. He was a carpenter before we came west. He did good work, Xavier agreed. The cabin burned hot and fast, but the structure itself was sound. He paused, glancing at her. Do you know anything about building, Miss Margaret? Some, she admitted. I helped my father when we first settled here. I can handle basic carpentry, and I'm good with a hammer. A glimmer of respect lit his eyes. That'll make things go faster. First, though, we need tools and supplies. They spent the morning clearing debris and salvaging what they could. By midday, they had a rough inventory of what needed replacing. Xavier suggested they ride into Silver Creek for supplies, offering Margaret a ride on his horse since hers had been stolen by the bandits. The journey to town was awkward at first, with Margaret seated behind Xavier on his chestnut gelding. She held tentatively to his waist, trying to maintain a proper distance despite the horse's gait, bringing them repeatedly into contact. You can hold tighter, Xavier said, after a particularly sharp turn in the trail almost unseated her. Rusty won't mind, and neither will I. Reluctantly, Margaret tightened her grip. Acutely aware of the firm muscles beneath his shirt and the clean, masculine scent of him. Leather, pine, and something uniquely his own. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of the horse's hooves a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. Tell me about Silver Creek, Xavier said eventually. What kind of town is it? Small, but growing, Margaret replied. The silver mines have brought in new people every month. There's a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a few other businesses. The people are decent, for the most part. And the law? Sheriff Thomas is a good man, but overwhelmed. Too much territory. Too few deputies. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. That explains why bandits feel comfortable operating so close to town. As they crested a hill, Silver Creek came into view, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with the tall structure of the mine works visible at the far end. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance they could see people moving about the main street. Their arrival in town drew curious glances. Margaret was well known, but the sight of her riding double with a stranger caused heads to turn. They dismounted in front of Jennings' general store, and Xavier tied Rusty to the hitching post. Margaret Harper! A plump woman with gray-streaked hair hurried down the boardwalk toward them. Child, I heard about the fire. Are you all right? I'm managing, Mrs. Calloway, Margaret replied, accepting the older woman's embrace. This is Xavier Eastwood. She hesitated, unsure how to explain their arrangement. I'm helping Miss Harper rebuild, Xavier supplied, tipping his hat to Mrs. Calloway. Pleasure to meet you, madam. Mrs. Calloway's eyes widened slightly as she assessed Xavier, her gaze moving from his trail-worn clothes to his weathered face. Well, she said after a moment, it's good you found help, Margaret, but you know you're welcome to stay with me until your place is habitable again. Margaret smiled gratefully. Thank you, but I don't want to impose. We've set up camp near the property, and it won't be for long. Mrs. Calloway's eyebrows rose even higher at the "we," but she merely nodded. You know best, dear, but my door is always open. After promising to visit soon, Margaret led Xavier into the general store. The proprietor, Mr. Jennings, greeted them with sympathetic concern. Terrible business, that fire, he said, shaking his head. Sheriff rode out yesterday afternoon when you reported it, but said there wasn't much trail to follow. No, there wouldn't be, Xavier agreed, but we're focusing on rebuilding for now. He produced a list of supplies they needed, and Mr. Jennings set about gathering them. While they waited, Margaret noticed whispered conversations and curious glances from other customers. Silver Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and a stranger helping the recently orphaned Margaret Harper was prime fodder for gossip. People are talking, she murmured to Xavier as they stood by the counter. He shrugged, seemingly unconcerned. Let them. We know the truth of it. Their next stop was the sheriff's office, a small building with a single cell visible through a barred window. Sheriff Thomas, a broad-shouldered man with a salt-and-pepper mustache, looked up from his desk as they entered. Miss Harper, he greeted, standing. I was meaning to ride out to check on you today. His gaze shifted to Xavier. And you are? Xavier Eastwood, he replied, extending his hand. I'm helping Miss Harper rebuild. The sheriff shook his hand, his expression guarded. You new to these parts, Mr. Eastwood? Just passing through, originally. Now thinking of staying. Sheriff Thomas nodded slowly. Well, we can use good men in this area. He turned to Margaret. I'm sorry about your place, Miss Harper. I tracked those bandits as far as I could, but they split up once they hit the foothills. At least 3 men, based on the tracks. Did you recognize any of them? Xavier asked. The sheriff shook his head. No one got a good look. They hit after dark, and Miss Harper was in town. He sighed heavily. Unfortunately, you're not the first. There have been 3 other isolated homesteads raided in the last month. Same pattern: wait until the place is vulnerable, then strike. They're watching the town, Xavier concluded, learning people's routines. That's my thinking, the sheriff agreed. Problem is, I can't be everywhere at once, and folks are spread out too far. If we hear anything, we'll let you know, Margaret promised. As they left the sheriff's office, Xavier's expression was troubled. He's right about one thing they're watching, We should be careful out there, especially while rebuilding. Margaret nodded, a chill running through her despite the warm spring day. Do you think they'll come back? Not right away, Xavier said after a moment's consideration. But eventually, they might check to see what's been rebuilt. His hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip. We'll be ready if they do. They collected their supplies from Jennings, loading them onto a pack horse the shopkeeper agreed to loan them until they could purchase one of their own. As they prepared to leave town, Mrs. Calloway intercepted them again, pressing a basket into Margaret's hands. Fresh bread, some preserves, and a bit of smoked ham, she explained. You need proper food if you're rebuilding, not just trail rations. Margaret thanked her warmly, touched by the woman's kindness. As they rode out of town, the weight of the day's events settled on her shoulders. The sympathy in people's eyes, the reality of her father's absence, the enormity of the task ahead, it all threatened to overwhelm her. You're quiet, Xavier observed as they followed the trail back toward the ruins of her home. Just thinking, she replied. A week ago, my life was ordinary. Now my father is gone, my home is destroyed, and I'm rebuilding with a man I met yesterday. Xavier was silent for a moment. Life changes in an instant, he said finally. The trick is figuring out how to keep going after it does. Margaret considered his words, finding unexpected wisdom in them. And is that what you've done? Kept going? Tried to, he admitted. Some days better than others. The honesty in his voice struck a chord within her. Here was a man who understood loss, who had faced his own devastation and survived. Perhaps, with his help, she could do the same. They reached the property as the sun began its westward descent. Xavier suggested they camp nearby again for the night and begin clearing the site properly in the morning. As they unloaded the supplies and settled in for the evening, Margaret found herself studying her unexpected companion. In the glow of the campfire, his features were softer, the hard lines of his face gentled by the flickering light. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with surprising grace as he prepared their evening meal, supplemented by Mrs. Calloway's generous provisions. Tell me about your travels, Margaret said as they ate. Where have you been since Kansas? Xavier seemed surprised by her interest but obliged. All over, really. Worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, spent some time in the Arizona Territory, even went as far north as Montana one season. A small smile crossed his face. Saw more country than most men see in a lifetime. Any place feel like home? The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Xavier stared into the fire, considering. No, he said finally. Not until... He trailed off, glancing at her before looking away. Margaret felt a flutter in her chest at his unfinished thought. Until? Until I saw these mountains, he finished, gesturing to the towering peaks surrounding them. Something about this country speaks to me. She nodded, understanding completely. That's how my father felt. We came from Pennsylvania after my mother died. He said the mountains would heal us. Her throat tightened with emotion. And they did. For a while at least. Xavier reached across the space between them, his hand briefly covering hers. They still can, Margaret. Healing just takes time. The touch of his hand, warm and reassuring, sent an unexpected thrill through her. She withdrew gently, confused by her reaction. We should rest, she said, rising quickly. Tomorrow will be a long day. If Xavier noticed her sudden discomfort, he didn't comment on it. He simply nodded, banking the fire for the night. Sleep well, Miss Margaret. In the quiet confines of the tent, Margaret chastised herself for her reaction. Xavier Eastwood was a kind stranger who had offered to help in her time of need. Nothing more. She couldn't afford to complicate their arrangement with foolish feelings, especially when she barely knew the man. Yet, as she drifted toward sleep, She couldn't help but remember the gentle pressure of his hand on hers and the unexpected sense of safety she felt in his presence. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the labor ahead. After a quick breakfast, they set to work clearing the burned remains of the cabin. Xavier proved to be as skilled as he'd claimed, methodically salvaging what could be reused and organizing the rest for disposal. Margaret worked alongside him, her determination fueling her strength. By midday, they had cleared most of the debris, revealing the solid stone foundation beneath. "Your father built this right," Xavier commented, examining the stonework. "Good. Tight joints. Proper drainage." He stood, brushing dust from his hands. "Makes our job easier." "How long do you think it will take?" Margaret asked, wiping sweat from her brow. Xavier considered the cleared space. "With just the two of us? 4 weeks? Maybe 5. Depends on how elaborate you want it." "Simple is fine," she assured him. "Just sturdy enough to withstand winter." He nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. We can always add on later if needed." The casual use of "we" and "later" wasn't lost on Margaret. It implied a future beyond the immediate rebuilding, a continuity she hadn't dared to consider. The thought both comforted and unsettled her. They worked through the afternoon, marking out the dimensions of the new cabin and preparing to salvage the usable timber. As the sun began to set, Xavier suggested they visit the nearby creek to wash away the day's grime. "Ladies first," he said, gesturing toward the burbling stream. "I'll keep watch from a distance." Margaret appreciated his consideration for her modesty. The cool water was a blessing on her skin, washing away soot and sweat. As she splashed her face, she caught sight of her reflection in a still pool flushed cheeks, tangled hair, a smudge of dirt still clinging to her chin. She looked wild, unkempt, nothing like the proper young woman her father had raised, yet something in her eyes had changed. The shock and devastation of that first day had been replaced by a steely determination that reminded her of her mother. "We endure," her mother had often said during difficult times. "Harper women always endure." When she returned to camp, her hair still damp but her spirits refreshed, she found Xavier had prepared a simple dinner of beans and salt pork, with the last of Mrs. Calloway's bread on the side. "Your turn," she told him, taking over the cooking. "Food will be ready when you get back." He disappeared toward the creek, and Margaret busied herself with the meal, trying not to think about Xavier Eastwood washing in the stream, water sluicing over his. She shook her head sharply, banishing the improper thought. This would not do. She needed to maintain clear boundaries if they were to work together effectively. When Xavier returned, his dark hair wet and his face freshly shaved, they ate in companionable silence. As night fell, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, brilliant pinpricks of light in the vast expanse above. "I never get tired of this view," Margaret said softly, gazing upward. In Pennsylvania, the trees were so thick you could barely see the sky. Out here, it feels like you can see forever. Xavier followed her gaze. "That's why I keep coming back to the mountains. Something about all this space makes a man's troubles seem smaller." "Do you have many troubles, Xavier Eastwood?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. He glanced at her, a half-smile touching his lips. "No more than most, I suppose. Just the usual regrets that come with living." "What do you regret?" The question hung between them, unexpectedly intimate. Xavier was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. "Not fighting harder to keep what was mine," he said finally, his voice low. "After the raiders came, I just left. Rode away from the ashes without trying to rebuild." He met her gaze across the fire. "That's why I stopped when I saw you. Thought maybe I could get it right this time." The honesty in his admission touched Margaret deeply. "We all have regrets," she said softly. "My father wanted to move west for years, but my mother was afraid of the journey. After she died, he was consumed with guilt for not bringing her when she was stronger, when she might have thrived in this air. And you? What do you regret? Margaret considered the question. Not telling my father how much I admired him, I suppose. He gave up everything to give me a new start after Mother died. I never properly thanked him for that sacrifice. Xavier nodded, understanding. Fathers and daughters. Complicated business. Did you have family back in Kansas? No, he replied. Never married. Came close once, but... He shrugged. Wasn't meant to be. Margaret wanted to ask more, but restrained herself. There would be time for such conversations in the weeks ahead. For now, it was enough to know that Xavier Eastwood was a man capable of regret and reflection, qualities she valued. As they prepared for sleep, Margaret paused at the entrance to the tent. Xavier, she said, her voice quiet in the stillness of the night. Thank you. For stopping. For helping. He looked up from where he was spreading his bedroll beside the fire, his face half illuminated by the dying flames. You're welcome, Margaret Harper, he replied simply. Now get some rest. Tomorrow, we start building. The next few days fell into a rhythm of hard work and gradual progress. They felled trees for new timber, prepared the salvaged materials, and began the framework of the new cabin. Xavier proved to be a patient teacher, showing Margaret techniques for notching logs and creating joints that would withstand the mountain weather. My father would have liked you, she commented one afternoon as they worked side by side. He always said you could judge a man by how he handles tools. Xavier smiled at that, the expression transforming his usually serious face. High praise. What else did your father say about judging men? That you can tell a man's character by how he treats those who can do nothing for him, she replied, remembering her father's wisdom. And by whether he keeps his word? Sound advice, Xavier agreed. My father had similar thoughts. He used to say a man's word was his bond, and once broken, never fully mended. Margaret studied him curiously. You rarely speak of your family. Xavier paused in his work, a shadow crossing his features. Not much to tell. Father was a farmer, taught me everything I know about building, about working the land. Mother died when I was young, like yours. It was just the two of us until I was 17. Then the war came. His jaw tightened slightly. He didn't come back from Shiloh. I'm sorry, Margaret said softly, understanding now why he had been alone when raiders destroyed his farm. He nodded acknowledgement but didn't elaborate further, returning to his task with renewed focus. As the days passed, the skeleton of the new cabin began to take shape. Word of their project spread through the scattered community, and occasionally neighbors would ride by, offering help or bringing food. Margaret was touched by their kindness, though she noticed Xavier grew quiet and withdrawn whenever visitors appeared. You don't like company, she observed after the Petersons. A family from 3 miles east had departed one evening. Xavier shrugged, whittling a peg for one of the roof joints. Just not used to it anymore. Been on my own too long, I suppose. Is that why you never settled again after Kansas? Too many people? He considered the question, his hands continuing their skilled work. Partly. Mostly, I never found a place that felt right, or people I wanted to stay for. The implication in his words wasn't lost on Margaret. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a dangerous feeling she tried to suppress. Attachment to Xavier Eastwood would only complicate matters, especially when their arrangement had a clear endpoint. Yet as the cabin walls rose higher and their days together lengthened into weeks, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet cowboy. She began to recognize the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something amused him, the slight furrow in his brow when he concentrated on a difficult task. More than once, she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze thoughtful and increasingly warm. These moments sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the growing connection between them. By the end of the third week, the cabin's outer structure was complete, and they began work on the roof and interior. The new building was similar to the original in size, but featured improvements. Xavier had suggested better ventilation, a more efficient fireplace design, and windows positioned to capture maximum sunlight. "You've thought of everything," Margaret marveled as they installed the last of the glass panes, a luxury she hadn't expected to afford. "Just applying lessons learned," Xavier replied. "My first cabin in Kansas taught me what works and what doesn't." As they worked on the interior, the close quarters brought them into frequent contact. Margaret became acutely aware of Xavier's presence, the brush of his arm against hers, as they maneuvered a heavy beam, the warmth of his breath when he leaned close to show her how to fit a door hinge properly. Each casual touch sent a thrill through her that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She found herself making excuses to be near him, asking questions she already knew the answers to, just to hear him explain, his deep voice patient and encouraging. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a particularly productive day, Margaret gathered her courage to ask a question that had been on her mind. "Xavier," she began, her voice hesitant, "what will you do when the cabin is finished?" He looked up from the saddle he was repairing, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That depends," he said carefully. "On what?" "On whether there's reason for me to stay." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Margaret's heart raced as she considered her next words. "The agreement was that you could build your own place on the land," she reminded him. "Yes," he acknowledged, "if that's still what you want." "Isn't it what you want?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. Xavier set aside his work and looked at her directly, his gaze steady and serious. "What I want, Margaret Harper, has been changing since the day I found you beside that burned cabin." The admission hung between them, fraught with meaning. Margaret felt a flush rise to her cheeks, and she looked away, unable to hold his intense gaze. "I should turn in," she said abruptly, rising to her feet. "Tomorrow's a big day." Xavier nodded, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Sleep well, Margaret." In the sanctuary of her tent, Margaret pressed her hands to her heated cheeks. Xavier's words had confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. His feelings for her were deepening, moving beyond the boundaries of their original arrangement. More troubling was the realization that her own feelings had shifted as well. She had come to admire his steady strength, his quiet competence, the gentle consideration he showed her at every turn. But was it wise to pursue such feelings? She barely knew him, despite the weeks they'd spent in each other's company. And her heart was still raw from her father's death, her emotions unsettled by all she had lost. Sleep eluded her as she wrestled with these thoughts. The sound of Xavier moving around the campfire, a constant reminder of his presence just yards away. Morning brought no clarity, but it did bring an unexpected visitor. Margaret emerged from her tent to find Sheriff Thomas dismounting from his horse, his expression grave as he greeted them. "Miss Harper, Mr. Eastwood," he nodded. "Cabin's coming along nicely, I see." "What brings you out this way, Sheriff?" Xavier asked, offering the man coffee from the morning pot. Thomas accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "Information I thought you should have. We caught one of the bandits who've been raiding homesteads. Man named Decker, wounded in a botched robbery attempt near Pine Ridge." Margaret's heart quickened. "Did he admit to burning my cabin?" "He did," the sheriff confirmed. "And he gave up his partners before he died of his wounds. Brothers named Caldwell Silas and Jeremiah. Mean pair with a reputation for violence." Xavier's expression hardened. "You know where to find them?" "Last seen heading toward Broken Spoke, about 30 miles south," Thomas replied. "I'm gathering a posse to go after them." but I wanted to warn you first. Decker mentioned they were planning to circle back through this area soon. Margaret felt a chill of fear. Here. Why? Unfinished business, according to Decker, the sheriff said grimly. Seems they didn't just want your property, Miss Harper. They were looking for something specific. Xavier stepped closer to Margaret, his stance protective. Did Decker say what? Thomas shook his head. Died before he could elaborate, but I'd guess it's something valuable. Something they think is still here despite the fire. Margaret frowned, trying to think what the bandits could possibly want. We had nothing of value, just our land and livestock, and they took the livestock. Maybe your father had something they wanted, Xavier suggested. Something you might not have known about. The sheriff finished his coffee and handed the cup back to Xavier. Whatever it is, be on your guard. I'll send word when we catch the Caldwells, but until then, I suggest you keep that rifle of yours loaded, Eastwood. After the sheriff departed, a tense silence fell between them. Xavier paced the perimeter of their camp, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest with newfound vigilance. We should finish the cabin as quickly as possible, he said finally. Get you proper walls and a door that locks. Margaret nodded, her mind still turning over the sheriff's words. What could her father possibly have had that would interest bandits? They had lived simply, with few possessions of value. The only thing of worth she could think of was her mother's wedding ring, and that had been in the tin box she'd recovered from the ashes. Unless... The strong box, she said suddenly, the memory surfacing. My father kept a small iron strongbox buried beneath the floorboards. He never showed me what was inside, just said it contained insurance for hard times. Xavier's interest sharpened. Did the bandits find it? I don't know, Margaret admitted. The floor was completely burned through in most places, but the box was iron, it might have survived the fire. Show me where it was. They hurried to the ruins of the old cabin, now mostly cleared away to make room for the new structure. Margaret oriented herself using the stone foundation, trying to remember exactly where her father's bed had stood. Here, she said finally, pointing to a section near what had been the back wall. Under his bed, beneath the third floorboard from the wall. Xavier knelt and began carefully removing debris from the area. The floorboards were indeed gone, burned away to reveal the packed earth beneath. He began to dig methodically, using a small shovel from their tools. After a few minutes of digging, there was a dull thunk as metal struck metal. Xavier's excavation revealed a small iron box, blackened by fire but intact. It was locked, with no key in sight. Your father never gave you a key? Xavier asked, examining the box. Margaret shook her head. No, I didn't even know what was inside. Xavier weighed the box in his hands. Something's in there. We could break it open, but... No, Margaret decided. If the Caldwells are coming back for it, let's wait for the sheriff to return with his posse. I don't want to risk them finding us with whatever's inside. Xavier nodded his agreement. We'll hide it for now. Somewhere they won't think to look. They decided to bury the box beneath their campfire, reasoning that no one would think to dig there. After concealing it safely, they returned to work on the cabin with renewed urgency, both aware that their time might be limited. As they worked, Margaret found herself watching Xavier more closely, noting the protective way he positioned himself between her and the forest's edge, the way his hand often strayed to the revolver at his hip. His concern for her safety was evident in every movement, every glance. By nightfall, they had completed the cabin's roof and most of the interior walls. The structure was nearly habitable, lacking only final touches like the door and window shutters. Another day, maybe two, and you'll be able to sleep under your own roof again, Xavier said, as they ate their evening meal. Margaret nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. What do you think is in the box? She asked quietly. Xavier considered the question. Money, perhaps, or deeds to other property. Something valuable enough to bring men like the Caldwells back to look for it. My father was an honest man, Margaret said firmly. Whatever it is, he came by it legitimately. I don't doubt that, Xavier assured her. But honest men can still have secrets. The truth of his words settled uncomfortably in Margaret's mind. Her father had always been straightforward with her, or so she'd believed. The existence of the strongbox and whatever it contained suggested otherwise. We should take turns keeping watch tonight, Xavier suggested, interrupting her thoughts. I'll take the first shift. You sleep. Margaret wanted to protest, but knew he was right. If the Caldwells were indeed planning to return, they needed to be vigilant. She retreated to her tent, though sleep proved elusive as she strained to hear any unusual sounds from the surrounding forest. When Xavier finally woke her for her watch, the moon was high overhead, casting silver light across the clearing. He handed her his rifle, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Any sign of trouble?" she asked, her voice hushed in the night stillness. "Nothing," he replied, "but stay alert. Wake me at the first sign of anything unusual." Margaret nodded, settling herself on a log near the fire as Xavier disappeared into her tent. The night was peaceful. The only sounds the soft hooting of an owl and the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. As she kept her vigil, Margaret found her thoughts returning to Xavier and the growing connection between them. In just a few weeks, he had become essential to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The prospect of him leaving once the cabin was complete filled her with a sense of loss that surprised her with its intensity. The dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Margaret heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats, approaching slowly from the south. She moved quickly to the tent, touching Xavier's shoulder to wake him. "Riders," she whispered as his eyes snapped open. "Coming from the south." Xavier was on his feet instantly, buckling on his gun belt and reaching for his rifle. "How many?" "I couldn't tell." "More than one." He nodded grimly. "Get behind the cabin wall. Use it for cover." They moved silently to the partially completed cabin, positioning themselves where they could observe the approach while remaining protected by the solid log walls. Xavier checked his revolver, then handed Margaret her father's hunting rifle. "Only if necessary," he said quietly. "Let me handle this if possible." The riders emerged from the tree line moments later, two men on horseback, moving cautiously as they surveyed the clearing. Even from a distance, their rough appearance and the way they carried their weapons suggested danger. "The Caldwells," Xavier murmured. "Has to be." The men dismounted at the edge of the clearing, tethering their horses to a tree before advancing on foot. They headed directly for the ruins of the old cabin, confirming Margaret's suspicion about their purpose. "Looking for the strongbox," she whispered. Xavier nodded, his expression hardening as he watched the men begin to search through the debris. "Stay here," he instructed, moving to circle around behind them. Margaret wanted to protest but remained silent, her heart pounding as she watched Xavier disappear into the trees. The Caldwell brothers continued their search, growing increasingly agitated as they found nothing. "It's gotta be here somewhere," the taller one growled, kicking at a pile of ashes. "Old man Harper wouldn't have let it burn." "Maybe the girl found it," the other suggested. "Place looks half rebuilt already. Someone's been here." "Then we find the girl," the first man replied, his voice cold. "Make her tell us where it is." Margaret's blood ran cold at the casual cruelty in his tone. These were dangerous men, capable of terrible things to get what they wanted. She gripped her rifle tighter, praying Xavier knew what he was doing. She didn't have to wait long to find out. Xavier's voice rang out from the tree line, steady and authoritative. "That's far enough, Caldwell." Both men whirled, reaching for their weapons, but Xavier had the drop on them. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed squarely at the taller brother. "Easy now," the shorter Caldwell said, his hands moving slowly away from his holster. "No need for bloodshed. We're just looking for something that belongs to us." Nothing here belongs to you, Xavier replied coldly. Sheriff Thomas is already on his way with a posse. Decker talked before he died. A flash of uncertainty crossed the taller Caldwell's face. You're bluffing. Am I? Xavier took a step forward. Drop your gun belts, both of you. For a tense moment, Margaret thought they might refuse. Then, slowly, the shorter brother began to unbuckle his gun belt. The taller one hesitated, his eyes darting between Xavier and the surrounding trees, as if looking for an advantage. Don't try it, Xavier warned. You won't get far. With obvious reluctance, the taller Caldwell finally removed his gun belt, letting it fall to the ground. Xavier gestured for them to move away from their weapons. On your knees, hands behind your heads. The brothers complied, though the hatred in their eyes was plain to see. Xavier maintained his position, rifle steady. Margaret, he called, not taking his eyes off the prisoners. There's rope in my saddlebag. Bring it here. Margaret hurried to retrieve the rope, her heart still racing. As she approached the captured men, the taller one, Silas, she presumed fixed her with a malevolent stare. You're the Harper girl, he said, his voice a low growl. Your daddy never told you what he was hiding, did he? Probably thought he was protecting you. Shut your mouth, Xavier snapped, prodding him with the rifle barrel. Margaret handed Xavier the rope, then stepped back, as he efficiently bound the brothers' hands behind their backs. Once they were secured, he relaxed slightly but kept his rifle ready. What now? Margaret asked quietly. Now we wait for the sheriff, Xavier replied. Shouldn't be long. He said he'd be gathering a posse yesterday. The wait proved shorter than expected. Within an hour they heard the approach of multiple riders, and Sheriff Thomas appeared with 4 deputies. He looked surprised but pleased to find the Caldwell brothers already captured and bound. Well now, Eastwood, he said appreciatively, saved us a lot of trouble. They came looking for whatever's in that strongbox, Xavier explained. Walked right in like they own the place. The sheriff nodded grimly. We'll take them back to town. They'll hang for what they've done not just here, but at the other homesteads too. As the deputies prepared to take the prisoners away, Silas Caldwell fixed Margaret with one last venomous glare. You open that box, girl. You'll wish you hadn't. Some things are better left buried. Sheriff Thomas cuffed him roughly. That's enough out of you. He turned to Margaret and Xavier. Whatever's in that box, it's yours by right, Miss Harper. But I'd like to know what these animals were willing to kill for. Margaret nodded, her curiosity and apprehension growing in equal measure. We'll bring it to town once we've had a look, she promised. After the sheriff and his men departed with their prisoners, a heavy silence fell over the clearing. Margaret and Xavier stood side by side, watching until the riders disappeared into the trees. It's over, Margaret said softly, the reality slowly sinking in. They can't hurt anyone else now. Xavier nodded, his expression somber. Let's see what was worth all this trouble. They retrieved the strongbox from its hiding place beneath the campfire and set it on a flat stone. The lock, sturdy despite the fire damage, presented a challenge. I could shoot it off, Xavier suggested. But that might damage whatever's inside. Margaret considered the box thoughtfully. My father always kept a spare key to important things in the same place. She reached for the small tin box containing her mother's wedding ring and carefully opened it. Sure enough, nestled beside the ring was a small iron key. Clever, Xavier commented as she held up the key. The key turned stiffly in the lock, but eventually, the mechanism gave way with a rusty click. Margaret hesitated, then slowly raised the lid. Inside lay several folded documents, a small leather pouch, and an envelope addressed simply to Margaret. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope first, recognizing her father's neat handwriting. My dearest daughter, she read aloud, her voice catching. If you are reading this, I am no longer with you. I hope you have lived a long and happy life before discovering this box. But if circumstances have forced its early opening, know that everything I did was to secure your future. Margaret paused, glancing at Xavier, who nodded encouragement. The documents enclosed represent my greatest secret and my greatest shame. During the war, while serving as a quartermaster for the Union Army, I discovered a Confederate payroll shipment abandoned during a retreat. The gold was intended for soldiers who would never receive it, their regiment having been decimated at Gettysburg. Margaret's eyes widened as she continued reading. I did not report the discovery. Instead, I kept the gold, telling myself it would help rebuild our nation once the fighting ended. I have lived with this decision ever since, neither fully regretting it nor finding peace with it. The gold has remained untouched, a reminder of my moral failure during a time when many good men made desperate choices. Xavier's expression remained neutral, though his eyes showed understanding rather than judgment. The deeds enclosed represent properties purchased with a small portion of the gold investments for your future. The leather pouch contains coins I kept as a reminder of my choice. The rest was converted to legal tender and deposited in banks across several states, the details of which are recorded in the accompanying documents. Margaret set down the letter, her hands shaking slightly. I never knew, she whispered. He never gave any indication. Xavier picked up one of the deeds, examining it. He protected you from this knowledge, he said quietly. Carried the burden alone. Margaret opened the leather pouch, pouring several gold coins into her palm. Confederate $20 pieces, their luster undimmed by time. She thought of her father, the honest carpenter who had raised her with such strict moral principles, carrying this secret for all those years. What do I do with this? She asked, looking up at Xavier. It doesn't feel right to use it. Xavier considered her question carefully. That's for you to decide, Margaret, but your father kept it all these years for your benefit. Whatever his initial choice, his intention was to provide for you. Margaret returned the coins to the pouch, her mind whirling with implications. According to the documents, she was now a woman of considerable means, with properties and bank accounts across several states. The modest life she and her father had lived in their small cabin had been a choice, not a necessity. I need time to think, she said finally, closing the box. This changes everything. Xavier nodded understanding. Take all the time you need. Meanwhile, we have a cabin to finish. His practical approach grounded her, providing a welcome anchor amid the tumult of revelations. They returned to work, completing the door and window shutters by nightfall. The cabin, though simple, was now secure and habitable, a new beginning rising from the ashes of the old. As they stood before the completed structure, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what they had accomplished, grief for her father and the secrets he had carried, and uncertainty about the future. It's a fine cabin, Xavier said, his voice warm with approval. Your father would be proud. Margaret nodded, blinking back tears. Yes, he would. She turned to face Xavier, suddenly acutely aware that their agreed-upon task was complete. What happens now? Xavier's blue eyes held hers steadily. That depends on you, Margaret Harper. I made a promise to help you rebuild, and I've kept it. But... He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I find myself reluctant to leave. The admission sent a flutter through Margaret's chest. Because of the land? She asked, though she knew that wasn't his reason. A small smile touched his lips. No, because of the woman who owns it. The directness of his statement took her breath away. In the weeks they had worked side by side, something had grown between them, a connection that went beyond their initial arrangement. Margaret had felt it building but had been too consumed with grief and rebuilding to fully acknowledge it. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. You don't need to say anything now. I know you've had more than your share of upheaval lately. His expression grew serious. But I want you to know that my offer stands not just to build a cabin on your land, but to build a life here, if you'll have me. Margaret's heart raced at his words. This man, who had appeared in her darkest moment and stood steadfastly beside her through weeks of backbreaking work, was offering her a future she hadn't dared to imagine. I need time, she said finally, to sort through everything: my father's legacy, my own feelings. It's all happening so fast. Xavier nodded, no disappointment visible in his expression. Time is something I can give you, Margaret. I've waited years to find a place that feels like home. I can wait a while longer. The understanding in his voice nearly undid her composure. On impulse, Margaret reached out and took his hand, her fingers twining with his. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. That night, Margaret slept in her new cabin for the first time, while Xavier maintained his camp outside. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the night through the new walls he had helped her build, she contemplated the choice before her. The revelations about her father's past and the fortune he had left her opened possibilities she had never considered. She could leave this place, start fresh somewhere else, perhaps even return east to the civilization her father had left behind. Yet as she considered these options, Margaret realized none of them appealed to her as much as the prospect of staying, of building on what she and Xavier had started. In him, she had found not just a skilled builder, but a man of integrity and compassion, someone who understood loss and renewal as intimately as she did. Morning found her decision made. She emerged from the cabin to find Xavier already awake, tending the fire as he prepared coffee. He looked up as she approached, a question in his eyes. "Good morning," she said, accepting the cup he offered. "I've been thinking about what you said last night." Xavier straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "And?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I've decided that I want to stay here. This land was my father's dream, and it's become mine too. As for his legacy," she glanced toward the strongbox, now safely stored inside the cabin. "I'll find a way to use it that honors his intentions while setting right what he felt was wrong." Xavier nodded, waiting for her to continue. "And as for you," Margaret said, finding courage in the warmth of his gaze, "I would very much like it if you stayed. Not just to build your own cabin, but—" She faltered, then pressed on. "But to see if what's growing between us might flourish." The smile that spread across Xavier's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. He set down his coffee cup and moved toward her, stopping just short of touching her. "Margaret Harper," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "nothing would make me happier." She closed the distance between them, her hands finding his. Then it settled. "We'll build again, together." Xavier's fingers tightened around hers. "Together," he agreed. In that moment, with the morning sun illuminating the cabin they had built and the promise of a future stretching before them, Margaret felt something she had not expected to feel again, so soon after losing her father Hope. Xavier Eastwood had ridden into her life when she was at her lowest point, offering not just practical help, but the possibility of beginning anew. As spring turned to summer, Margaret and Xavier settled into a rhythm of shared work and growing affection. They traveled to Silver Creek together to report the contents of the strongbox to Sheriff Thomas, who agreed that the Confederate gold, technically spoils of war, was legally Margaret's to use as she saw fit. After much consideration, Margaret decided to use the majority of the fortune to establish a fund for families affected by the war, both Union and Confederate. The rest she would keep as an investment in their future, using it to expand their homestead and eventually build the larger house Xavier had begun designing. Their courtship progressed with the steady, deliberate pace that characterized everything Xavier did. He built his own small cabin on the property as originally agreed, though he spent more and more evenings with Margaret, talking by the fire, or simply enjoying each other's presence. The first time he kissed her was on a warm June evening, as they sat on the porch he had added to her cabin. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and when Margaret responded with unexpected fervor, Xavier laughed against her lips, a sound of pure joy that made her heart soar. By August, the valley was lush with summer growth, and the homestead had expanded to include a small barn, a chicken coop, and the beginnings of a vegetable garden. They had purchased new livestock, 2 milk cows, a small herd of sheep, and horses to replace those stolen by the Caldwells. It was during the harvest moon in September that Xavier formally asked for Margaret's hand, presenting her with a ring he had commissioned from a silversmith in Denver, a simple band inlaid with a small piece of turquoise. "It's the color of the Colorado sky," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "The sky I was under when I found you, when I found home." They were married in October, in a small ceremony at Silver Creek's church. Mrs. Calloway wept openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed, while Sheriff Thomas offered a hearty handshake and his sincere congratulations. That evening, as they returned to their homestead as husband and wife, Xavier surprised Margaret by lifting her into his arms at the threshold of her cabin, their cabin now. "Welcome home, Mrs. Eastwood," he said, his voice tender as he carried her inside. "We've come a long way from that first day," Margaret replied, touching his cheek gently. "When I was crying beside a burned cabin and a stranger rode up to offer help." Xavier set her down carefully, but kept his arms around her. "Best decision I ever made, stopping that day." "And the second best?" she asked, leaning into his embrace. His smile was warm as he looked down at her. "Saying we'll build again, together." As winter descended on the mountains, bringing snow that blanketed the valley in pristine white, Margaret and Xavier found warmth in each other and in the life they were creating. The cabin that had risen from ashes became a home filled with laughter and love, a testament to resilience and the healing power of beginning anew. And when spring arrived again, bringing with it the news that their family would grow by one come autumn, Margaret stood with Xavier on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and rose. "Are you happy?" Xavier asked, his arms secure around her waist, his hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly. Margaret leaned into him, thinking of all they had endured and built together. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. The legacy her father had left, both the burden of his secret and the opportunity it provided, had opened unexpected doors. But it was Xavier Eastwood, the cowboy who had stopped to help a grieving woman beside a burned cabin, who had truly given her a future worth building. As the last light of day gilded the distant peaks, Margaret turned in her husband's embrace to kiss him, grateful beyond words for second chances and promises kept. Together, they had rebuilt not just a cabin, but a life one log, one day, one shared dream at a time. And as Xavier's arms tightened around her, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced all others together, building something stronger and more beautiful than either could have created alone.